So we again have this beautiful first reading from the prophet Isaiah as we had last weekend. And Isaiah is my second favorite prophet. My first favorite prophet in the, it's only in the Old Testament, would be Amos. So if you're ever looking for a fun Saturday night or Sunday afternoon, read the book of Amos. It's really short, but you have to read Amos in like a Danny DeVito voice, and it's very enjoyable, believe me. But then Isaiah is my second favorite prophet because he has just this beautiful way of writing and giving hope. At the time of Isaiah, they're in exile during the Babylonian exile, and so Isaiah is writing for hope of the Messiah and coming back to Jerusalem and the temple. But even for us who are not in a Babylonian exile, Isaiah still is a great voice of hope for us. I think that what we can take away from our readings this Sunday in Advent is understanding that God hears the prayers of his people. Now, of course, we can all in our lives know that God does not answer our prayers in our preferred timeline, right? But we have to remember what we heard in our second reading from St. Peter. Do not ignore this one fact, beloved, St. Peter writes, that with the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years. So God's timeline is not our timeline. And that's okay, right? That's actually a good thing. God is God, we are not. That's beautiful, all right? I don't need to be God. No thank you. But to understand that, God does answer our prayers, that's something we see throughout the whole of the Scriptures, right? What comes to mind most readily is the book of Exodus. So in the very beginning of the book of Exodus, it might be the first chapter, I don't know, I'm not as good with the chapters and verses, but in the very beginning of Exodus, before Moses comes on the scene, the Hebrews are in slavery in Egypt, and they're calling out to a God, any God. Now, by the time we get to the beginning of Exodus, Joseph is long dead and buried with his Technicolor Dreamcoat. All right, lots of time has passed. The Hebrews that are left over, that are now in slavery, they kind of remember some stories from their grandparents about Joseph and his father Jacob and their grandfather Isaac and great-grandfather Abraham. Like, they kind of remember these stories, but they don't have much of a connection. That's how much time has passed. And then they have the polytheism of the Egyptians that just confuses them even more. And so these poor Hebrews who are in slavery are just calling out to any God who will listen to them, asking for help. And God hears them, right? The one true God hears them, the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, hears their call. But does he snap his almighty fingers and then boom, they run the world? No. Then Moses is born. And then he gets put in the basket in the Nile, and then Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, and we know the whole story, right? That takes one man's whole lifetime to answer that prayer of the people for freedom. Think of all the Hebrews who died as Moses was growing up and getting into his vocation, who thought that prayer would never be answered. So God's time, again, doesn't happen in our timeline. It happens in his, but the prayer is still answered. Ultimately, Isaiah writing here in the Babylonian exile, Isaiah's writing in the hopes of the Messiah to come to free them, to bring them back to Jerusalem so they can worship God in the temple. They're waiting for the Messiah, Emmanuel, God with us. Okay, they eventually get freed from exile. But again, Isaiah and his disciples, they're writing over a period of 70 to 80 years before they get freed. And it's not the Messiah who frees them, obviously. The Messiah still comes a couple hundred years later in Jesus. So God does answer prayers, my brothers and sisters, but it doesn't always happen on our timeline. So instead of having the mindset of, something must be wrong with me because my prayer's not being answered. Adding an extra rosary doesn't really matter, right? An extra Our Father at the end of the night, that's not going to do anything. Please do it. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Pray that rosary, all right? 2 rosaries a day never killed anybody. It made them holier, all right? But the problem isn't your prayer, right? It's not that maybe God isn't hearing me because I'm not praying hard enough. That's a tool of the devil then, because that just leads you down the whole like, well, does prayer even matter? It matters. Believe me, it matters. But instead of continuing to pray for this thing, pray for a deeper sense of faith. Pray for a growth in your trust that God is going to answer that prayer. Pray for a deeper understanding of the desire in your heart, right? I go back to the cheeseburger salad example. I'm hungry. My superficialness tells me the cheeseburger is going to satisfy me immediately and take over the hunger, but really the salad is what's really going to give me nutrients and help my life. So the desire, yes, it's to be fed, but God wants me to have the salad. But if I just go after the superficial desires, I'm going to go for that cheeseburger and, die of a heart attack someday. I'm working on it. But anyway, we don't need to get bleak here. So God is hearing the prayer. What's wrong is not us, nothing's wrong. But instead of thinking I have to pray harder, we all do, just now think of it in terms of your faith. Do I trust that God is my Father? Do I trust that as a father, he's going to hear my prayer and answer it? If I trust in that, then I just keep sharing my desires, my prayers, my needs with the Father, and I can trust that they'll be answered. If I don't trust that God is my Father, and that my Father won't hear and answer my prayer, well, there's something to work on, especially in this Advent season. Now stop praying for the salad or the cheeseburger. Start praying for a deeper trust and an understanding of who God is. That he is Emmanuel, that he's with us, that he's our Father, that the Spirit overshadows us and guides us to him, that ultimately God is love. And love always responds, as it has to, with more love. When we have that trust and that confidence in who God is, then we can always trust that our prayers are being answered. One last example from my own life. When I was young and I would pray for my vocation, I was praying for my small v vocation, right? I was pretty set that I'd get married and have a family and not live by myself. I don't live by myself, but even though priesthood came up a lot when I was younger, I never wanted to be a priest. My answer is just, okay, no thank you, because I'm an only child. My parents knew they had perfection after one, right? I'm also a coward, and so I did not want to live by myself for my life. I wanted, a wife and kids to help me not be afraid of the dark. And so, my sacramental vocation, I thought that was set. But as I, grew up and was in high school and college and grammar school and praying for my vocation, I was always looking toward a career. What does God want me to do with my life? And I thought about being a fireman, but I'm afraid of heights, so that wasn't going to work. Thought about being a police officer, but again, I'm a coward. That's not going to work. Thought about being an architect, and then I took geometry in high school. That's not going to work. And then theater, became a thing. I was like, okay, I can kind of do theater. I like this. This is fun. And I did it, but knew that in my heart, this isn't my vocation. It's not what God wants from me. Never in my life did I think that priesthood would be what would bring me happiness and joy. And it totally is. I can't imagine doing anything else but being a priest. But 7th grade Dominic heard this from Father Dominic, I would have laughed in my face. That priesthood would be what would bring me ultimate joy and happiness and peace. The Lord answered my prayer. I wanted to be happy, and I'm more than happy. I'm overjoyed. It's not quite how I thought it would happen, also not in my timeline, but the prayer was answered. So friends, let's grow in that trust that God is our Father, and he will answer our prayers.